What's up guys, Station here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Werewolf build. Basically, nothing much has changed between Elsewhere and Scalebreaker when it comes to Werewolf builds, outside of the introduction of Maarselok as a potential monster helm set to use as a Werewolf build. So not much to go over in terms of major changes. No new sets were introduced. Again, outside of Maarselok, no big changes were made to the Werewolf skill line. So pretty much everything that you have seen in the Elsewhere video pretty much stays exactly the same in this Scalebreaker patch with Werewolf DPS. That is to say, they do very good DPS considering the ease of the rotation is simply just a series of 3 buttons. But they do not really match up to any sort of non-werewolf DPS at this point. So if you guys are interested in getting started in vet trials, werewolf might be a decent option for Kraglearn trials. But as you get into more advanced DLC trials, werewolves do they do have a few limitations to them, which does end up reducing their overall effectiveness in those more late those sort of DLC trials, particularly things like Asylum, Cloud Rest, even Sunspire. It's a little bit more difficult to complete those as a Werewolf DPS, so I would still recommend whatever class you decide to use as your stamina DPS werewolf to also learn that class in a non-werewolf form. That way, if you come to the point where you kind of have crested with the werewolf DPS, you're able to at the very least swap over to the non-werewolf rotation for your class and do just as good, if not better, DPS that way. So, like the rest of our build videos, we're going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you know to recreate this build yourself. We will talk a little bit about the rotation. The rotation is actually quite simple, like I alluded to earlier, so we won't be going over that too much, but then we'll close things off with a 21-minute dummy parse so you guys can get a sort of comparison between other stamina builds on my channel. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here, first with gear. So like I mentioned, pretty much nothing has changed in terms of gear for werewolves. So pretty much skills remain the same, gear pretty much remained exactly the same. Again, there's only one set that was introduced in Scalebreaker that could potentially make its way onto the werewolf sort of toolkit, and that would be the new monster helm set, Maarselok. So everything remains exactly the same. So you have Molag as your helm and your monster helm and shoulders, stamina divines, all medium. You have Relequens, again, perfect version here, but you can go with non-perfect version if you prefer. And then Lokkestiiz. So one of the things to keep in mind with a werewolf is that you only have access to whatever you have on the bar that you have the werewolf Automaton. So typically speaking, that will be your dual wield bar. So realistically, if your goal is to maintain werewolf form as long as you possibly can, which is kind of the assumption behind this build, doesn't really matter which set goes where. So whether it's Relequen or Lokkestiiz, as long as it is on your dual wield bar and you're in the werewolf form the whole time, that's all that matters. Naturally, I would recommend sticking with Relequen as your body set, and then Relequen as your body set and Lokkestiiz as your front bar set, just because if you do happen to drop out of werewolf form, at the very least with Relequen on your body, you don't have to worry about losing all those stacks or potentially losing all those stacks if you're caught on your back bar or anything like that. So my recommendation would just be forgo Relequen on the body and then Lokkestiiz as your front bar set. So for Lokkestiiz, perfect, non-perfect, kind of same thing with Relequen. It's mainly that unique 5-piece bonus that makes these sets so strong. Adding in the weapon crit from Lokkestiiz, the perfect version, is great, but it's overall not really going to make that big of a difference on your DPS. Same thing with Relequen. You're really using it for the 5-piece bonus, the unique 5-piece bonus, not so much for the max stamina bonus there. So again, doesn't really matter whether you're getting the perfect or the non-perfect version. In terms of other sets that you might want to consider running instead of Relequen, there's only a handful of sets that I would recommend running as a werewolf, because werewolf is kind of geared around maximizing your overall weapon damage as well as your light attacks. So the one set that I really recommend would be Blood Moon, which comes from March of Sacrifices. So whenever you deal critical damage with a melee light attack, you gain a stack of Blood Scent for 8 seconds. Once you gain 5 of these stacks, you become frenzied for 5 seconds, increasing your melee light attack damage by 30% and attack speed by 50%. This effect can occur every 18 seconds. This actually does comparable, if not better, DPS than running Lokkestiiz on the front bar. So if you are in a position where you're not going to be able to get a lot of synergies to use with Lokkestiiz, Blood Moon is actually a very, very good alternative for Lokkestiiz. In terms of maximizing overall DPS in a true raid environment, Lokkestiiz is going to inch out above Blood Moon by just a hair, but Blood Moon is definitely still a very powerful set to use as a werewolf. The other thing that I would recommend running would be Tzogvin's Warband, which is decent because you will be able to maintain minor force. One of the downsides of a werewolf is that you don't have any source of minor force unless a DPS or basically anybody is a stalwart guard on you. So using Tzogvin's Warband, you get the additional weapon crit from the 5-piece, you get some additional physical penetration, so you can run something like nirn on the main hand, precise on the offhand for your dual wield bar. So that way you get both nirn and the additional crit chance there, and you get that minor force, which is actually quite a bit of additional DPS. Even though we are in sort of crit damage, crit meta, you definitely want to get that minor force uptime here. So Tzogvin's Warband is actually a pretty decent option for a werewolf. Not quite as strong as Lokkestiiz or Blood Moon. The minor force you get from Tzogvin's Warband doesn't quite reach that same sort of level compared to just boosting your overall light attack damage or just giving you major slayer. But you can combine this with Relequen if you don't need that set. For example, if you are going between multiple targets or Relequen's not really well suited for a specific fight, Tzogvin's is a very powerful set to run as your one of your sets here. Beyond that, your typical stamina DPS sets, Hunding's Rage, those are all pretty decent sets here too. Again, because you're pretty much are only on one bar, it doesn't really matter what set goes where, but you still kind of want to keep to the paradigm of static bonuses remain on the body set, proc sets stay on the front bar sets. That's the general paradigm you still want to follow as a werewolf DPS. So sets like Briarheart, Hunding's Rage, all the other sets that we've kind of covered in other stamina DPS videos are still very, very powerful. There's kind of a almost complete list in the description below for all the different sets that you could run instead. Now, I do also want to point out for Maarselok sets, you can still go with your typical stamina DPS sets. So those would be like Selene's, Velidreth, but Maarselok is also a decent option here. It does require you to know when to bash, so you need to bash every 7 seconds, but because you're just straight up light attacking as a werewolf, very easy to sustain even though you would be bashing every 7 seconds. Maarselok is actually fairly strong as long as you're able to get a lot of negative effects on the boss, so those do include things like your werewolf bleed, your double ravage health poisons, those all count as negative effects, as well as other sort of debuffs that are provided from support roles. So it is possible to do quite a bit of DPS with Maarselok here, but in general Molag will be a little bit easier and a little bit stronger as well, just because the weapon damage bonus is going to be stronger than the max stamina bonus from Maarselok there. So again, gear, very, very easy, very, very simple, mainly because of the fact that we just have one bar. We don't really need to worry about the bow bar at all, so we don't really need to worry about really running anything. I do still recommend running the Master's Bow, and I still recommend going Dagger Axe, even though you don't get any sort of additional dual wield passive bonuses. In the instances where you will not be in werewolf form, it's still good to be able to do good DPS. So Dagger Axe is the strongest combination right now for stamina DPS in non-werewolf form, so I still recommend going Dagger Axe. Jewelry traits, enchants, all that stuff, divines, max stamina enchants, all medium for armor, and then jewelry, bloodthirsty or infused with weapon damage enchants. Robust is the only option you have if you don't have access to jewelry crafting and you can't transmute things. Otherwise, stick with bloodthirsty or infused. Those are both pretty powerful jewelry traits. Then for weapons, nirn on the main hand, and then sharpened on the offhand here, so pretty much exactly what you would expect to see on your typical stamina DPS, and then your double ravage health poisons here on the front bar. Then again, I do recommend having the Master's Bow or the Maelstrom Bow, depending on whether you want to prioritize single target over AoE DPS. Which, regardless of which type of bow you choose, you still want to do infused with a weapon damage enchant here. For our character sheet, I am a Dark Elf. Dark Elves are going to be one of the stronger races when it comes to stamina DPS in general. 1875 max magicka and 250 additional weapon damage. Let me just double check to make sure I have those passives actually. I do. So pretty strong. If you want to maximize your DPS race-wise, then Orcs are going to be your best option because they get a little bit more max stamina than Dark Elves. They get 2,000 max stamina compared to Dark Elves 1875. Plus they get that 250 additional weapon damage still. So Orcs are definitely going to be the strongest option here, followed by Dark Elves. Again, all the different stamina races are still pretty decent. So Red Guards, Bosmer, Imperials, those are all fairly decent options here. Going to be weaker in general compared to Orcs and Dark Elves because neither of those races get 258 additional weapon damage. But if you are kind of in a position where you're still learning your non-werewolf rotation, running something like a Red Guard or a Wood Elf, or an Imperial with the additional sustain bonuses might help you be able to sustain a full light attack rotation outside of werewolf form. But to maximize DPS, Orcs and Red Guards or Orcs and Dark Elves are going to be your best options here. All of our points are going into stamina here. We're drawing full light attack rotation as a werewolf, so we don't need to worry about sustain at all. So we're running blue food, which does give us enough health to kind of meet the minimum health recommended for vet trials, which would be around 16.5 to 17k max health before Ebon and before toughness. So don't need any points into health here. We are using parse food here just so that way we get a even basis of comparison between this build and other builds on my channel. But beyond that, we would be using blue food. So you would still have about 16.5 to 17k max health depending on your specific race. For example, Orcs will get a little bit more max health just because you do have a little bit of additional max health built into one of your racial passives. Shadow Mundus, no surprise there, no big changes to Mundus stones at all. Then again, we're running parse food here just so that way we have an even level of comparison between other stamina builds on my channel. Skill bars, very simple because again, you only have one bar as a werewolf. So in terms of morphs, Feral Pounce is going to be useful to help maintain a werewolf transformation, but Brutal Pounce will be stronger for AoE. In fact, Brutal Pounce is your only source of AoE damage on a werewolf outside of other skills. So definitely pick either one you want. So if you want to be able to better maintain your werewolf form, run Feral Pounce, otherwise Brutal Pounce for the additional AoE. For the healing morph here, go with Hircine's Fortitude rather than Hircine's Rage, mainly because you'll be getting major brutality from your weapon damage, weapon power potions. So you don't really need the additional major brutality from Hircine's Rage. It's pretty much redundant because you can't double down on major brutality. So it's better to get that larger heal from Hircine's Fortitude instead. The extra heal is not that much because it does scale off your max health, but every little bit does help. For Roar, in a trial scenario, deafening Roar is not going to be particularly useful because you do have tanks that are already running Pierce Armor for a major fracture. That being said, in AoE pulls, deafening Roar can be very useful in certain trash pulls. It does require, I believe they might have changed this, but in the past it used to require that you had to fear and actually be able to fear enemies in order to get the major fracture to apply, but it might have changed so that major fracture applies no matter if they're feared or not. But generally speaking, in trials, you do have other sources of major fracture, so it's better to go with Ferocious Roar instead for the off balance. In terms of the piercing Howl morph, either morph is fine, Howl of Despair or Howl of Agony. Howl of Despair is going to give you a little bit better utility because it does provide the Empower synergy, Feeding Frenzy synergy, that'll help boost other DPS, so I prefer to go with Howl of Despair over Howl of Agony. And then Claws of Anguish versus Claws of Life. Major Defile pretty much has no use in PvE, so just go with Claws of Life for additional healing done, which is actually quite a bit if you consider how much disease damage that you're doing. And in terms of ultimate, Werewolf Berserker is the only real option here. You don't have a bleed with your light attacks with Pack Leader. Pack Leader was changed in, I believe it was elsewhere, to be quite a bit weaker. So Werewolf Berserker is the new morph of choice for DPS. To the champion points, your CP distribution is going to be very different as a werewolf compared to your typical stamina DPS in terms of your blue CPs. Green and red CPs pretty much remain exactly the same. So for green CPs, it'd be 100 Mooncalf, 75 Tenacity, or however much you want to put in Tenacity, depending on, whether you're heavy attacking a lot on your non-werewolf form kind of thing. Then I have 31 Shadow Word, 31 Tumbling, 33 Warlord. But for green CPs, just make sure to get that 100 into Mooncalf. Everything else is sort of use as you see fit. Blue CPs, we are going to try to maximize our physical weapon experts, so basically maximize our light attack damage. That's really where werewolves shine. Even though the bleed is very strong, the majority of our DPS does come from light attacks, comes from direct damage, so we're not putting any points actually in the Thaumaturge. We're instead putting them very heavily into physical weapons expert, mastered arms, and etc. There are 27 physical weapons expert, 61 mastered arms, 56 precise strikes, 62 into piercing. This will change depending on whether you're running something with a physical penetration bonus like Tzogvin's. You would basically be able to reduce this down by about 1500. Or if you're running double sharpened, you can reduce this down by another approximately 1400. Then mighty, 64 there. And then the red CPs are going for a balanced approach like we always do in all of our builds. So 81 ironclad, 61 thick skin, and 64 in both hardy and elemental defender. So again, build itself for Werewolf is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. There's not that many sets out there for Werewolves that have very good synergies outside of Blood Moon. Pretty much any set that's good on a stamina DPS would be good on a Werewolf. And again, you don't really have to be too concerned about which set goes where because you're only running on one bar. Now the rotation itself, very easy. It's basically, like I mentioned earlier, 3 buttons. You can add in more depending on the situation, but usually it's just going to be the 3 buttons. It's just going to be Light Attack, Howl of Despair, and Claws of Life. So basically the idea behind this is you just Light Attack the whole time, so you just Light Attack spam the whole time, and then you just use Howl and Claws of Life, and you just basically keep on doing your Light Attacks. Pretty simple, pretty easy. What I like to do is whenever I have to re-up Claws of Life, just also do Howl at the same time. The synergy from Howl does have a 20-second cooldown like all other synergies, so people can activate it every 20 seconds. Up to 6 people should be able to activate the synergy, so you basically activating every 10 seconds does kind of give you pretty decent time. Plus, if you're with the tank and tanks within synergy activating distance, then every 10 seconds does kind of give you a little bit of offset here for Alkosh for all the other synergies as well. So I like to do it every 10 seconds, just because, again, a lot of your damage is going to be coming from light attacks rather than from your abilities, so you just want to maximize your overall light attack spam. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the rotation. Again, like I said, very simple, very straightforward. So we're going to go ahead and do our 200 million dummy parts here, just so you guys can get an idea of basically what kind of DPS we're able to pull. Again, this is going to be comparable to other stamina DPS, potentially. We are losing out on the Minor Force, like I mentioned earlier. Werewolves do not have a native source of Minor Force unless you're running Tzogvin's Warband. In this instance, we're not running Tzogvin, so we do not have any source of Minor Force here. So our DPS is going to be a little bit on the low side just because we're not getting any sort of Minor Force. We will be getting 100% Major Force uptime, which is obviously unrealistic. It's impossible to get that in a raid, so kind of evens out a little bit. But generally speaking, this part should be comparable to other DPS specs that I have on this channel. So let's go ahead and start here with the 21 million dummy parts to see just how much DPS we're able to pull. So it's very simple because all you have to do is just mash your left mouse button or whatever you have decided to keybind light attacks to. It could be the left mouse button. I've heard people just kind of map it to the scroll wheel, so that way you just scroll in one direction the whole time. Kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. So one of the things here is that because we're in the werewolf form, we wouldn't actually be getting a lot of use out of Maarselok, hence why Molag will be stronger in a dummy parse. We're not getting any sort of negative effects from our support roles because we obviously don't have support roles with us here. So just keep that in mind here. If we were using Maarselok, we would get a lot more negative effects active. So things like Major Fracture, Major Breach, all those would count towards the Maarselok's additional damage. So Maarselok does have, like I mentioned, the potential to do more DPS than Molag does. Very brain dead rotation here, very easy to do, very good DPS here. And then again, it's not going to be quite as high as other stamina DPS with their full light attack rotations with the bow bar. If you just think of it kind of from a terms of resources, a standard build, non-werewolf build, has twice as many abilities to work off of versus the werewolf, which only has just one set. You don't have any sort of back bar. You can't use your bow to apply any sort of additional dots. So again, a lot of your DPS is going to be coming from your light attacks, and you'll see that in the comp metrics parse at the end of this video here. You're pretty much relying on sets and light attack damage to really kind of match or to get close to the DPS that your standard light attack dual wield bow build is running. Other weaknesses of the Werewolf build do include a general lack of AoE damage. Again, you do have one morph of Pounce, which is good for AoE, but that's pretty much it. On any other source of AoE is going to be coming from your set bonuses, whether that's a monster helm like Maarselok or a set like, I can't really think of any off the top of my head, Velidreth. So that's one big weakness. The other weakness is your CPs are not really, for werewolf form and non-werewolf form, they're not really interchangeable with each other. So for those guys who see my other stamina DPS builds, you'll notice that we have a very different CP distribution. We have a lot more CPs into Thaumaturge, a lot less into Physical Weapons Expert and Master at Arms, because those CPs just aren't as important. We have more dots as a non-werewolf DPS. So if you fall out of werewolf form in a fight, then you're kind of limited. If you're running something like this, where you're running Relequen and Lokkestiiz, you will be in fairly decent shape until you're able to get enough ultimate to get transferred back into a werewolf form. But falling out of werewolf form is a little bit tricky, because you will not necessarily be able to maintain werewolf form in particularly longer trial fights. And of course, you are limited to only within melee range, so if you ever need to back up for any reason, or the boss is moving around a lot, it gets a little bit tricky to basically maintain that DPS. You do have Pounce, so you're able to pounce on a boss that is, flown away from you, but you are pretty much only limited to staying within melee range versus other non-werewolf builds, which do have the option of running bow builds to go full ranged. So quite a number of weaknesses with the werewolf build, along with the slow loss in DPS, kind of made them unfavorable in a lot of vet trials environments. They're still capable of doing very good DPS, just not quite as much as they used to be back 3 or 4 patches ago, back in the Wolf Hunter, when Wolf Hunter was first released about a year ago. You can see here where you might not even be able to hit 70k here. We'll see if we'll be able to hit 70k or not. I don't think we're going to be able to hit it. We might be able to break 68, but that's pretty much it. Yeah, we broke 68, but we weren't able to quite get up to 70. The DPS, as you can see here, a lot of it is coming from light attacks, Relequen, Claws of Life, so it's a pretty even split between where your DPS is coming from in terms of light attacks versus, which is direct damage, and dots, which would be your Werewolf Bleed, Arms Relequen, Claws of Life. Fairly even split here, but because light attacks do so much DPS, you will want to put a lot more emphasis on Physical Weapons Expert as well as Master at Arms compared to Thaumaturge. You might want to shift some points around, to kind of maybe put a couple points into Thaumaturge if you can. If you'd like, you can drop, for example, Mighty down to 49 if you'd like, but generally speaking, this CP distribution is probably going to give you the best results overall. But you can see here, not quite as high as other DPS. Other standard DPS are easily able to pull 90k, high 80ks. The Werewolf, on the other hand, at least for this particular build, is only able to pull about 68.4k, so quite a bit lower. The trade-off is, of course, that your rotation is far simpler. Also keep in mind that using sets like Maarselok and Raid and Blood Moon will show you a little bit better DPS, but you probably won't be breaking 75k or so on a dummy here. Without a lot of support, things like Stalwart Guard to give you the minor force, and so on. So Werewolf DPS has definitely fallen since the Wolf Hunter DLC, but it's still not a bad build. 86.4k is still definitely enough to get through a lot of vet trials, but unfortunately, Werewolves still have the stigma, especially in endgame, your DLC trials, of being not that great DPS. But again, the lower DPS is the trade-off for having a much simpler rotation. But that's going to be it for this build video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions about the build itself, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.